The title of my talk comes about because I was sitting in a coffee shop where they were playing Madonna. It was 80s days, and Get Up Again over and over is a Madonna lyric for those of you who remember back in the day. All right, so me. My Twitter handle, I work in the release engineering group at Chef, and because Matt Peck jinxed me yesterday, I have to say, I'm Yvonne, this is my coworker Seth, this is my coworker Seth, and this is my other coworker Seth. So hopefully I can forget about that now because he totally earwormed me with that. So I've done a lot of things, mostly in the land of non-functional requirements. So in alphabetical order, my past roles include things like build engineer, deployment engineer, ops engineer, perf QA engineer, release engineer. Past product domains I have worked on are NLP, so natural language processing, and data mining stuff, mobile, scientific programming, and bits and pieces of high-performance computing, mostly involving compiler testing, crash codes. The first crash code I worked on was declassified the year that I was born. I do not recommend this as an experience. And a thing that was called RAS at the time, so reliability, availability, and serviceability components. So this adds up to sort of two things. One of them is that I confuse the heck out of recruiters. The second thing is that I have a lot of opinions about experiments, and I have a lot of opinions about infrastructure because I've built a lot of infrastructure to support experiments. I've built a lot of experimental infrastructure, and I've supported a lot of other people's experiments and infrastructure. So I have opinions. And they basically boil down to this scene from The Emperor's New Groove, where it's, it's like, why do we even have that lever? And that's kind of where it is. And that is sort of an interesting thing when I start thinking in terms of DevOps, in terms of continuous delivery, in terms of all the cool stuff that we are working on. So a couple of thoughts here. One of them is, so continuous deployment expands the range of what actually counts as production infrastructure, right? So last year, my coworker, the mighty Sasha Bates, gave a talk at ChefConf in which she said, dev is production, and every sysadmin, everybody who's managed a lab, everybody who's had the dev environment that you can never take down because, oh my God, the schedule, we all know this. I would flip that around to say, production is the stuff people use. Whether they pay money or not, it's production, right? I mean, you break the stuff people use and people will tell you about it. So continuous deployment makes it really visible that production depends on your delivery pipeline, your Jenkins instances, your CI, all of that stuff. Even to some extent, your dev workstation environment, these are getting a little bit closer to production. I mean, I'm just going to keep saying the word production and mean this kind of non-traditional production as well as, traditional prod environments because I got tired of typing near production. So that was thing one. Thing two is to know whether an experiment delivers value, you really do have to run it in production, right? So, when you think about this in terms of user features, in terms of things that customers actually see, this is pretty clear, right? You make this big change to the UI, you're not going to know, until it actually gets in the hands of people, whether they like it or not, whether they buy things, whether they use it. It's actually also true for infrastructure, right? So I was debating about whether to talk about this or not, but kind of the ghost behind this talk is a project that I worked on that had 20 developers and every NoSQL store known to man. This roughly means that you have a different NoSQL store for every 4 developers. And they had Postgres, not Java, or not Oracle, because you have to pay money for that. But they had a lot of stuff. And it was a lot of stuff that I think went into production for good reasons, in that, we think it'll add value, we think it'll add features, and then, they try it for a while, and it's like, yeah, not so much, it doesn't do quite what we want, it doesn't perform quite the way we want, but they wouldn't have found that out without putting it into a production environment. So, thing 3, config management adoption, which is something that's happening a lot more and more these days, and sort of the whole move towards DevOps and the whole move towards, shared responsibility for operations means lots of people are doing lots of things with production infrastructure for the first time, keeping in mind that production means near production as well, right? So lots of experiments. So I tend to have two reactions when I look at stuff that I've done in the past. And the first one is, wow, I was really smart back then. I wonder what happened. And then the other reaction is, what the hell was I thinking? So just generalizing from that one anecdata, we're going to have a lot to, refactor or replace, like as people rethink things that they've done. And this is okay. This is totally normal. But it means that we have experiments. These are experiments that aren't just, oh, we're going to put a new thing out there and see if people like it. These are experiments where we put a new thing out there, and yeah, if it works, we have to move the people over to the new thing because that's how it delivers value. So, but this is why the title, Learning and Relearning. So just to be clear, the kinds of experiments I'm talking about include, not just sort of traditional kinds of things like, putting a new data store into prod, say. Like that's going to be the example floating at the back of my mind. But automating processes that were not previously automated, that's one. Tooling that changes the dev workflow. It's like, yeah, you update a change to that cookbook that everybody's dev environment depends on, and you break stuff and you will hear about it. Introducing new components to an existing prod infrastructure. So, okay, that's the traditional one. And building and updating and replacing CI for infrastructure code. Because, it's like, yeah, your pipeline is what you used to deliver. It's now nearer production than it was when you delivered, like twice a year. And people are going to care. Like, people are going to notice when it breaks. So what does this all mean? I think what it means is that we need to get good at managing experiments involving production infrastructure of various kinds. And this is actually kind of a hard thing. So just to be really clear, in my mind, this talk is about making sure that you have the right lever. Like, this is about making sure that nobody pulls on a lever where, you fall through the trapdoor and you come climbing back out with an alligator stuck to your butt. This is not so, I originally started thinking about this as a talk about how to make prod safe for experiments and testing, and that's not really what this talk is about. I mean, you should totally do those things. Don't get me wrong, you should absolutely do those things. But this is a talk that is, in some sense, PTSD from the kinds of times when we let experiments go out, like either into dev or into prod, and and it does not go well. And we're sitting around afterwards and talking about all the things we should have had in, to like catch this thing, things like log monitoring and canary deploys and I had a third one and it's gone now, but things like that, things like passive data collection and visualization. And then at some point somebody, and sometimes it's me, will just put their head down on the bar and be like, okay, even if all that's true, they reel off this big long list of things that were wrong with the experiment to start out with, and they're like, why did we even let this get this far, right? And so I think there's thinking that we have to do about not just how we experiment in prod, but like when we even let get to that point. So how? And so the how here is actually, well, these are some of the failure modes that I've seen in experiments. So like I tried to phrase them as positives, but behind every one of these, there's a war story. and you catch me afterwards and I'm happy to tell you the war story. But the things that I've seen that I think people really need to focus on are, and some of these will sound really dumb, are, well, when you're doing an experiment, remember that you are doing an experiment. Like, it sounds dumb, but people forget. Limit your variables. Plan for negative results. So in this case, negative does not mean bad, right? Negative means a result where it's not clear one way or the other if you've gained anything, right? So, it's like, did this thing that we did have any effect? And that's the thing that we often don't plan for. And cleaning up after you're done, because one of the things about experiments is that, well, you kind of want to keep the mindset that this might not be forever. And that's sort of that's sort of a thing that you see a lot, is that, well, it was, then it's like, well, it's a lot of work to get that new data store into production. And once it's there, even if people are like, yeah, maybe not so much. I mean, it's not as easy to use as we thought. We don't really, we're not seeing the performance improvements. The thing that was supposed to have the great support for interacting with this data store, no, it doesn't. All of those things, and it's like, so you have this thing sitting out there supporting half a feature. You kind of want to, we have a tendency to leave those things, and my argument is that we really shouldn't do that. So thing number one, remember you are doing an experiment. An experiment is intended to determine whether you should proceed further along certain lines. I don't really think of it as something that it's like, this is the way it's going to live forever. But a lot of times it ends up being that because there's so much effort involved in pushing an experiment to production, right? I mean, it has to pass through multiple sets of hands. So, like the ops people need to know about it, and the on-call people need to know about it, and you need to write monitors, and like project managers are involved, right? It's not cheap to do these production experiments, and we don't really necessarily, like once they've gone through all of that, we think, yeah, you're tall enough to attack the city, even though they might not be. Like, we've just put so much effort into it. We tell the joke about shipping the prototype. Don't. That is my favorite. That's like my canonical example of an experiment where it's like, no, we should have remembered that was an experiment, and we totally just forgot. So, an example of this that I had in mind was, I worked for a company like back in the day where they just started doing hack days, and somebody did an experiment that was a really cool experiment, but it was involving a programming language that they were learning that nobody else in the company knew, and it showed off a really cool feature. Well, this guy left the company, and then a couple of months later, product management gets really excited because a competitor comes out with a similar feature, and they're like, that thing, we want that thing, the thing that we saw that demo of, it was awesome, this will solve all of our problems. And they sort of bullied a bunch of people into getting it, into like trying to put it into production. And then I got as far as ops, and we looked at it and we were like, so you understand that this is we totally get that this is a really important feature. This is a high business value feature. But it's not even clear that anybody here knows how to restart this thing, like if it should just stop working. Like it's not clear that we could save the data, that we could bring it back safely without, overwriting something you don't want us to overwrite. How do you feel about that? And then product management is like, but we likes it. It's pretty, and it's like, yeah, I get that, but you have to be okay with the risk. You have to be okay with, we're good. It's like, yeah, you put this out there, and we have nobody around who knows how to fix this thing. So eventually, they decided not to do that. They decided to implement a safer version of that feature, which made me very happy because I was not looking forward to trying to figure out how to wrap this thing so that we could actually minimally support it. Talking about experiments. So if your experiment lasts more than a couple of days, you're probably going to have to give status on it, right? You're probably going to have to tell people how it's going. You're going to have to you're going to have to communicate about it, which you should be doing anyways. But the things that I would urge you to do are to remind people that they are looking at something that is an experiment, right? Like, this could go away. We could decide that this is a complete and utter piece of crap, and we would make it go away. But you have to remind people because they will forget. Dev VMs often start as hack day projects, and they're great, and people get enthusiastic about them, and that's wonderful. And then they spread, and then you find out that they don't do everything that people want, and they become, this is totally a thing that depends on your culture, right? Sometimes people are just like, okay, it doesn't do what I want, I'll fix it. And sometimes, it spreads too far. It spreads to somebody who can't fix it, they don't know how, they're on deadline, whatever. And they're like, well, my thing, it broke. I depend on this. And it's like, yeah, but that was an experiment. We didn't, we weren't intending for you to use it like that. So yeah, you do have to remind people, like a demo in big letters, good thing. Under construction, also good thing. So I have not tried the second thing, by the way, but I saw a really great presentation by Adele Shakal a couple of weeks ago at the Cascadia IT conference called Nerd Herding on the Frontier. And what she's talking about is introducing project management culture to organizations and projects that may not have seen it before. So it's a really great talk. I highly recommend it. She's a very good speaker. But in particular, one of the things that I like about the talk is that she illustrates how to do status reports for projects with Post-it notes and a whiteboard. So you can totally do informal Gantt charts with sticky notes and a whiteboard. And, I really like this thing where, her point is like, this is the frontier. You have to remind people that this is the frontier, right? I mean, you're not going to have a full-fledged project plan for that. So obviously, I'm sort of assuming that this is not the moon landing, right? That you're not doing an experiment where, it's this giant experiment involving millions of dollars and, tons of people, and it's going to be, the project. So, but highly recommend that talk. So my next point was limit your variables. This is one that is near and dear to my heart because it happens a lot in new automation adoptions. So cross-platform experiments, they are at least 2 experiments, 1 per platform, not 1. Automating something you do not already know how to do is at least 2 experiments, not 1. I feel particularly strongly about this one because the release engineering group at Chef is the owner of the Jenkins cookbook. So we see people trying to set up a Jenkins instance using the Jenkins cookbook, and they have something quite complicated in mind, and that cookbook's not really intended to be the big red button. It's just not that kind of a cookbook. And variables include people, right? I mean, you've got in traditional prod, it's like those are your consumers, like the people that pay you money for things. In a dev environment, it's your devs, and there's a fine art to having people be involved and letting them give feedback, and getting the best possible user feedback you can, and letting your experiment get out to so many people that you just totally lose control over it. So why cross-platform experiments can be challenging. And by the way, not all cross-platform experiments are challenging. I mean, we do a lot of cross-compilation. We do a lot of cross-platform builds and things like that in our build lab, and they're challenging, but they're a technical challenge, so they're fun. They can be stressful, but they can be fun. The kinds of things I'm talking about are like where you're trying to make something happen cross-platform across an organization, like you're trying to do DevTool adoption cross-platform across an organization. And one of those things that I think makes it really hard is that cross-platform dependency management is kind of its own thing. Distros move at different speeds. They adopt things at different times. They don't version things the same way. So one of the things that I found on a cross-platform Ruby project was you cannot necessarily lock your gem files the same way with the same set of dependencies on Mac or Linux as you would in Windows, because you might really need that bug fix for Windows, or it pulls in this other dependency or something like that. And it's not a bad thing. It's just something you have to know to manage. And we let stuff float for a really long time on that one, and we probably shouldn't have. And there's always a platform that lags, right? Then what do you do? Like, do you go with the speed? You have to make a decision about, do you go with the speed of the thing that moves fast, or that people can make really fast progress on, and it's really satisfying, and it's really cool, and it's really, this is where you see the awesome, right? Or do you go with this thing that, do you try to put effort behind the slow platform, and get it faster, which, by the way, the community will love you if you do this, because it's like I've never seen that not be true. But that's the thing you have to take into account in your project planning. But, and then there's just like, this is especially bad if it's like workstation tools, right? Because then you have people who are on one platform that just isn't as nice as the other one. And, they have feelings about that, like you wouldn't expect them not to. But yeah, it's a thing. Sidebar. So because I'm a release engineer and we have spent a lot of time, listening to people talk about Berkshelf and talk about cookbooks and stuff like that, I thought I'd have a sidebar on dependency management. So one of them is lock your dependencies, just know how to manage them. There is a caveat to this, which I will cover in the next slide. But yeah, basically lock your dependencies, know what they are, know how you're getting them sucked in. Another one is consider hosting your own dependencies. Like, we see this a lot with community cookbooks, again, where people want to use the community cookbook, but that means they have to get their particular use case adopted to the community cookbook, whether or not that's really that might or might not be the right thing for the cookbook in somebody's opinion. So, if you host your own, you kind of don't have to worry about that. Another reason to host your own is that a lot of projects have policies that are intended to push you to the bleeding edge. So, like anybody deal with Node.js, how they do the thing where they release a new package and then the old one goes away. Yeah, that's not fun. Like if if you're in the middle of an experiment and and you had to update a bunch of dependencies in order to be able to move, and then you're like, yeah, we're not going further with this. We need to put it back, or we need to get it back to a stable state. I know all about roll forward, but we need to get it back to a stable state. Like, we've determined that this is the right thing to do. It's kind of hard to do that if you don't have the package. So yeah, consider hosting your own stuff. I have thoughts about dependency storage. So structured is better than unstructured. That's another one of my little things. Like dumping stuff in a structureless file share sounds like a really good idea until somebody overwrites something and you don't know what changed, and you have to track it down, or somebody kind of breaks the version string, and so things don't list out in quite the right order. So there's just all kinds of things with unstructured storage that are problematic. I mean, they won't necessarily bite you right away. It's not the worst thing in the world to start with unstructured storage, but like as you grow, you will want to move towards structured storage. Another thing that comes up a lot is, like I did this with chef cookbooks quite a bit. When I started out, where it's like I had the world's most complicated base roll cookbook with like all of the logic in the world in there. And that was great until I had to update it. Like, anybody have to do that? Because then you have this thing that's like sits at the bottom of your dependency stack, and you update it, but there are things about it that you don't really know how you do it in dev and it kind of works and you fix all of those things, and then you do it in stage and a different set of things break and you fix those, and then you're like, shit, what's going to happen when I try to push this to prod? So I think that a lot of times people put way too much thought into how they arrange their cookbooks and how they write and all of that stuff, and it's like, I wouldn't say don't put no thought into it, but you should put like some thought, but not too much thought. But like, this is one of the things that I think is worth considering that people often don't. And that I totally did, because it's like, I was excited. It's like, I can capture my infrastructure in code. This is really cool. I can make this really awesome. And it's like, yeah, you go to update it, and no. I mean, like, I was months migrating off of that stuff. It was not fun, and my coworkers were not happy with me. Another thing, versioning for people is different from versioning for machines. So, if you're doing continuous delivery and you just make everybody eat their broccoli when, so like everybody, they test the change and they adopt it or they reject it when it comes out, then that's a very different thing. Like, you can have machines assign your version numbers. You don't necessarily have to follow semantic versioning if you don't want to, because it's like, well, it's this number that's assigned by a machine. But if you're versioning to tell people, hey, this is a breaking API change, that's a very different thing. So I think these are some of the things that it's worth considering as you're setting up in the world. So I kind of think, as a release engineer, that it would be a little bit silly to talk about dependency management without mentioning Heartbleed. So, we were bitten by Heartbleed. We had, lots of people did a lot of work to get everybody patched and issue new packages and things like that. And we held a postmortem, and one of the things Adam said on our postmortem was just everything needs to eat the broccoli, right? Sometimes that's just true. We ran into, our problem was that things that were in maintenance mode, so like those Chef 10 packages that people are still using that we still support minimally, those were really hard to update because they were hard pinned. And, we're trying to adopt a philosophy of maintenance versions need to be able to build with security packages, right? And this goes for systems as well, that it's like, yeah, you have this really old, Ubuntu instance running something that isn't, that it's not really, it's sort of on that edge, you kind of want it to go away, so you're trying not to put effort into it. But sometimes you really do need to be able to just, rebuild the thing with the right security patches. Variables include people, right? You are telling your users what you are doing, yes? Because if you push a breaking change to a cookbook or you push a breaking change to the CI pipeline and it breaks, people will be upset. Especially if they stayed late in an effort to try to get something done. Where it's like, you pushed it because you were thinking, oh, well, if it breaks, it'll break in the morning and I'll be around and I can fix it. And it's like, no, just tell people, do not push quietly. The greater the number of people that get involved in an experiment, the more you really need to have clear interfaces for training and support and bug fixes and new versions and stuff like that. And I think that's something that's worth thinking about as, I think the stuff we do is awesome. I want everybody to see it. I want everybody to use it. And then you start getting bugs back for weird platforms, or your use case is not their use case, and how do you make, should you bend your tool to support their use case? I don't know. Is this something? And by the way, there are those alerts going off, and there's this other project work coming down the pike, and how much time should I be spending on this? And it's like, so this is a thing to consider about. I tend to like to roll out to friendly adopters, and then work my way over, the adoption curve that Rob Cummings described in his talk, where it's like, yeah, I'm okay with the late adopters picking things up by osmosis when they're ready. I really I tend to want to restrict to friendly adopters. And people want their tools to just work, right? Because they depend on them. DevStation tools, it's like, yeah. I used to work on compilers, and a lot of people, especially benchmarkers, they want the latest in compilers. And if you break the compiler build, that is very, very bad. They will be very upset with you. The only thing I found to deal with the last one, I think this is, this Etsy post made me so happy when I saw it, because it was like, wait, yes, that's the thing I've been looking for. It's create interfaces that hide iteration. I love that sort of their origin story that they told at the time about Deployinator was that, well, they had a bunch of stuff that they wanted to fix. And they also had, but that stuff had users, it had consumers. And so they put an interface in front of it so that people could still do their work, right? They didn't need to change anything, they could be trained to use the new interface, but they could do whatever behind the scenes. And as long as it didn't affect the interface, nobody had to be retrained. And I think that's kind of an awesome thing. I am not a UX person, so this may seem totally obvious to a lot of you, but it never would have occurred to me if I hadn't read that blog post. Automating something you don't already know how to do is 2 experiments, not 1. And sort of a subset of this to me is that automation isn't really does not have to mean it's a simpler user interface for people. I mean, hopefully it's more efficient for people, but that doesn't mean that if you don't know how to set something up, that your best bet is to try to automate the setup of it right away. I mean, really build a small one manually first, And, just give yourself, that couple of hours to experiment with, finding all of the things that were totally obvious to the person who wrote the cookbook, but are not necessarily captured in the logic of the cookbook. Be prepared for negative results. So in this case, negative means there's no clear effect on value delivered. Sometimes this is a good thing. It means you don't have to change what you're doing. Like that Postgres instance out there, it works fine. That, your developers aren't really gaining in productivity by using this other thing. It's like, yeah, you tried it, it was okay, nobody loved it, it doesn't change the world. That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Clean up when you're done. And context matters, right? I mean, context always matters when you're talking about mess, where, some people just have a much higher tolerance for mess than others. And that is, that's organizational. I can't tell you how to do that. I will say that, in some places, like you would totally, a polyglot environment is part of the fun, right? It's a fun thing about the environment that there are tons of programming languages represented, that there are all kinds of different tools, that there are all kinds of different things, and they're in active use. And that is great, that is awesome. You can also have an environment that from the outside sounds similar, but it really isn't, because what it really is a pile of twigs with a lot of overlap. And those things are kind of scary because I think the test for a working system of that sort is, do people want to work on it? Right? Because it's like, if they don't, then that is a bad thing. I mean, then what you have is a pile of technical debt waiting to happen. And infrastructure that goes nowhere interferes with the legibility, with how hard it is to interpret the system from the outside, and it makes it harder to manage. And my analogy for this is wikis, right? So, there was a time when put it in the wiki, like everybody's heard that, right? And, you did, and then it changed, and did you update the documentation? Or, you go and you look at the wiki and it's like, well, this page hasn't changed since 2008. Does that mean that the thing hasn't changed since 2008? I don't know. I mean, maybe, kind of. So yeah, it's like when you have things out there that aren't really in active use, or they're in active use but they're going away or stuff like that, then it's kind of hard for people to know what to do in that infrastructure. And it's like when people are trying to move fast, that's the thing that makes them have to look at their feet, and it's hard to move fast when you have to look at your feet all the time. My experiment was a success. Now what? Well, you've added a thing that delivers value, which is awesome. Like, that is totally cool, and you should be really proud of yourself. And because I'm sort of one of these depressive sorts, well, if you've done a replacement, then you need to migrate people off of the old thing to the new thing. And you've proven that the new thing works. That is totally cool. But migration from an old system to a new one takes a really long time. This is why you end up with 4 production LDAP services. It's because you can't make the old one go away, because it's not a good time for some other project, right? Or there's something that somebody has to do that it's like, or you try, you try to shut down the port, and then you find out that it's like that all of these other things start breaking somewhere. Like, I had a friend who was hired as a contractor to remove a pre-Solaris Sun license server. It was the license server for their whole business. Like, this was how they earned their money. And this was in the mid-2000s, and they couldn't do it. It was like completely, like, all of the mount points, all of the NFS stuff. It's like every time they just tried to turn it off, they broke everything in the company. So yeah, people are afraid of migration with good reason. And they're afraid of deprecation. So it's worth running an old system and a new system sometimes together, just to get the gain from the new system. And yes, it impairs legibility, and I kind of hate that. We all kind of hate that. But you get the benefit of, okay, you have this new system. People can use the new system, and we can try to make the old one go away. So that was kind of an abrupt ending, but that's the ending. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I'm also having office hours in the Marina Room in 20 minutes. And, my contact info is up there if you want to ask me further questions. So questions. Seth, can you microphone?
You can talk really loud, too.
Well, yes, but those people in the back can't hear you and the video can't hear you.
You mentioned earlier the wiki effect, where you have cruft hanging around or outdated information. What sorts of things would you say work better at reducing that problem?
Something that friends who work at Amazon have told me about the Amazon wiki is that it comes with a little toolbar on the side that gives you deprecation statistics. They basically take all of the stuff, I don't remember what their wiki tool is, but they basically parse the wiki logs, the edit logs for a page, and they put stuff on the side so that you can see, oh my God, the last edits were huge, right? So, it's not necessarily, it's not perfect. I kind of wish we could do the same thing for infrastructure to say, don't put stuff there, don't put stuff on, do not talk to the first LDAP server, right? That thing is going away. If you talk to it, it will only cause problems, and things like that. I personally have found that nagging is I'm the boring person who's who at every meeting about something is yeah, and we have to make that thing go away. That could, that's sort of tiring on you, but it can work over time because people will eventually, eventually people will just be yeah, we already knew that. And, they'll just think you're being boring, but you have to keep reminding them until it's gone. But yeah.
At some point you talked about locking your dependencies. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by the term dependencies?
I think when I wrote that slide, I was specifically thinking about software versioning and dependencies in terms of, you have this code, right, that describes your infrastructure, and that code has a bunch, you have cookbooks, you may have gems, you may have other applications that you're pulling in to do things I don't know, monitoring, or to do stuff on hosts that you care about. And that is, that's really what I was thinking about. I was thinking about how, sometimes having a really deep dependency tree is really bad because you have this, that's the role cookbook, you have the thing at the bottom that if you make the wrong judgment about how frequently you have to change it, that can have really nasty side effects. There are a lot of dependency visualization programs out there, so I do not know. I think that there are definitely programs where you can dump out the dependency data in the form of a JSON object or something like that and feed it to something else to give you a graph, right? So that you have some sense of how things fit together. These things are not necessarily perfect because they won't necessarily resolve your dependencies the same way as the consumer of your dependencies, but they will at least give you an idea that it's oh yeah, we're dependent on 3 different versions of Nginx here, and that's not a good thing. Any other questions?
I think that's all the time we have.
Okay.
So thank you, everyone. Let's give Yvonne a round of applause.